of Rear Window. We'll get going in just a minute. People are sort of coming into the Zoom room, as you will, and I know some folks are watching us on YouTube as well. So we'll get started. Well, we might as well get started now. It's 6:30. As many of you know, my name is Andrew Douglas, and this is part of our Bryn Mawr Film Institute's Film Studies online series. Tonight, we will be discussing Rear Window, and I am very happy to have with us Professor Paul Wright of Cabrini University. And before we get to your questions and comments about the film, we'll get to hear a few remarks about the movie from Professor Wright. So Paul, take it away.
My name's Andrew Douglas.
Thank you. So first of all, it's really a delight to be with you all virtually. It's not the same as being with you in a theater or in a classroom, but we'll have to make do. I've been teaching a lot online lately, like a lot of college professors these days. So in itself, it's not that surprising to me, but this is my first BMFI Zoom experience. So I have the jitters in a good way, I think. And I'm really happy to be with you and to be with Andrew. I want to thank Andrew for the invitation to participate here, and also for his remarks that really set us up. If you were able to take a look at the short video introducing this session, if you didn't get a chance to watch it, take a look at some point. It really frames this classic Hitchcock film very well. The remarks I have are fairly brief to build on some things that Andrew was already saying, maybe to add a few new points. And then I know we want to open it up to your questions and to conversation and simulate as best we can the kind of experience that we normally count on at Bryn Mawr Film Institute. One of the things I'll say about the film is, paradoxically perhaps, it's simultaneously one of the best star-driven movies ever made and one of the best ensemble-driven movies ever made. And by that, I mean, you have plenty of star power here. If you put Jimmy Stewart together with Grace Kelly, add an excellent supporting cast, including Thelma Ritter and Raymond Burr, if you have Hitchcock directing, you sure have more than enough star power. I don't care what era of filmmaking we're talking about. This is the kind of film that's going to draw you in because of the director, because of the leads, because of the main supporting player. But by the same token, those of you who know and love the movie, even first-time viewers, obviously you can see how dependent this film is on the often silent but visually arresting ensemble cast that Jimmy Stewart's character is watching through that window as he convalesces. Without those players doing what they do, often without words, the whole movie won't work as well as it does. And so in that sense, I very much think of it as an ensemble piece. I also think it's simultaneously, again, maybe paradoxically, one of the stagiest movies ever made, and simultaneously, one of the most profoundly cinematic movies ever made. And by that, I mean, think of the fact that this is not filmed in Greenwich Village, New York, although it sure feels like it. It's filmed on an elaborate soundstage at Paramount, cobbling together basically the equivalent of a Greenwich Village tenement on a soundstage that wasn't originally intended for this purpose at all. In fact, they had to cut into the basement level of an existing soundstage just to create the ground level of the whole apartment complex. So the amount of work that was required just to create the soundstage itself is extraordinary, and it's used to extraordinary effect. In certain ways, we get a simulation of what in the theater world you'd call a theater in the round. You have all of these different perspectives and angles with which to look at everyone, including Jimmy Stewart in his apartment, and watching him interact with all these people coming into his lives, in particular, Grace Kelly and Thelma Ritter. By the same token, as stagey as it is, right, I said it's also very, very cinematic. And if you think of the use of long shots and long takes in this movie, the patience with which Hitchcock trains the camera on every bit of action, the way in which he allows that camera to linger, not just to build suspense, but to invite us into a whole other world of other people's lives that Jimmy Stewart is peeping in on. that is something you can only do with cinema. It's not something you could pull off, or certainly not in the same way, if you were simply doing this on a theatrical stage. And perhaps the last thing I want to touch on here before opening it up to questions for both Andrew and for me, um, it's often said that Stewart's character in the movie is a stand-in both for the audience and for Hitchcock as director, right? So we have this notion of all of us as voyeurs and the price we pay to peer into other people's lives. That's something Andrew touched a little bit on in his remarks in the video, but it's worth coming back to again, because this movie, made all the way back in 1954, is frankly prescient in the way it anticipates our fixation with things like reality television and the entire culture of surveillance that we now live in. All of that, in a way, is implicated in the things going on in this film. You might remember Thelma Ritter, who is just as good as anyone can be and as good as she has ever been, playing the role of the home healthcare worker for Stewart. At one point, she indicts his peeping Tom behavior, but really indicts all of us by saying we've become a race of peeping Toms. That's a quote right from the movie. And as they start to debate his behavior during this convalescence, his fixation on the lives of all these other people out that window, Ritter and Stewart also get into a debate about marriage, right? You might remember Grace Kelly being portrayed, even before we meet her in the film, as too perfect for Stewart, right? He's too happy with her. It just can't possibly work out. And of course, it doesn't hurt that you're building up this image of a perfect girlfriend, possibly wife, and it turns out to be Grace Kelly in that really iconic scene where he wakes up from a slumber and sees her hovering over him. But before we even meet her, Thelma Ritter, the healthcare worker, is complaining to Stewart about the way he thinks of marriage, not just that he's letting a really great person go potentially because he's not serious enough about her, but also the way his entire generation, if you will, thinks about marriage really offends her. And one of the things she says that I always come back to, she says, "I'm not an educated woman, Mr. Jeffries, but I can tell you one thing. When a man and a woman see each other and like each other, they ought to come together, wham, like a couple of taxis on Broadway, not sit around analyzing each other like two specimens in a bottle." And then Jeff, Stewart's character, says, well, we do things more intelligently now, right? There's an intelligent way to approach marriage. And Stella, Thelma Ritter, says, intelligence? Nothing has caused the human race so much trouble as intelligence. And I want you to think for a moment about that term and go beyond what might be your initial understanding of it, right? Of course, we're thinking about smartness, the ability to be insightful, the ability to read a situation, to pick the right person to date, etc. But think of how important the idea of intelligence and the word intelligence has been in a lot of Hitchcock's other movies. If you think about North by Northwest, Notorious, The Man Who Knew Too Much, and a host of others, you think of intelligence in that kind of global foreign policy sense. And when you start to come back to the word with that perspective, you start to think of it as our knowledge of other people, not just our smartness, not just our sense of who we want to hang out with or marry, but our sense of knowing anything and everything about everyone. And that's exactly what Stewart is looking for in his boredom as he convalesces in that apartment. He's looking to learn about everyone. It's not just the potential murder of a wife by Raymond Burr that has his attention. It's everyone in that complex. All of their lives, all of their stories are at his fingertips. He's looking for total information awareness, as the intelligence community would call it today, of that entire complex. And when you think of that, it's really, I think, a perfect movie for us to talk about right now because of our own sense of isolation that we're in at this moment. I mean, so many of us are detached from our normal way of life, from our workplaces, our schools, our friends, our activities, our hobbies, our athletics, you name it. We're so detached from all of that, that we're all living a kind of Jimmy Stewart existence right now. We're all convalescing, hopefully to be healthy again and to overcome the threat of this horrible virus that everyone's facing. And we don't know how it's all going to turn out, but we know we can't stand the way it feels. And that's exactly Jimmy Stewart's perspective in this movie. He's not facing coronavirus, obviously, but he is facing boredom and isolation. And so this movie is very focused on that question of community and how, when we are in isolation, we sometimes turn to perspective and judgment on others. It becomes important to us to know what other people are up to, in part to contend with our own boredom, and in part to feel a sense of mastery and control in a situation in which we otherwise feel helpless. And in that way, the movie is perfect for this moment. I was going to watch it again anyway because Andrew had asked me to do this, but even before he asked me, I was already getting ready to watch it because I've been creating my own little quarantine film festival at home and trying to pick films that really speak to the question of isolation in one way or another, to face that problem rather than run away from it. And Rear Window, I think, perfectly exemplifies it. So that's really what I wanted to say by way of introduction. Andrew, I think we want to open it up to the group.
Yeah, before we do, I just want to remind people they should have the means to raise their hand metaphorically within Zoom at the bottom of their screen. I would ask them to do that. That's how we'll know who to call on. In addition, we do have colleagues monitoring the chat. So if there's a sort of side debate or questions pops up in there, we'll hear from our colleagues on that front as well. But I see for now, try to remember to keep yourselves muted unless or until you're about to talk. And I see that Lisa has her hand up. So Lisa, what did you want to ask about?
Good evening. I have a question about the end of the film when they talk about the hat box. Is there a way we can figure out from the film what's in the hat box, or is that left as a Rorschach test? Thank you.
Paul, thoughts?
Sure. I was actually thinking of that myself because I was afraid I'd missed something on this past viewing. But you might remember Thelma Ritter has this sense of perverse gratification when she feels like I was kind of on to how this was all playing out all along, once she's on board with the idea that there has actually been a murder. So when the police come and they start talking about the hat box, my understanding is that Burr, right, the killer, had buried the wife's head in the garden at some point, and the dog was sniffing around that. And so eventually he had to do away with the dog. And also the hat box, could no longer be there containing a severed head or whatever. And so, she gets this kind of Ritter, right, gets this kind of grisly satisfaction that she had anticipated the degree to which he would want to dispose of the body. So I think the implication is the head was there. Andrew, I don't know if you read it differently or.
No, I don't read it differently. And of course, to me now that immediately made me think of the movie Seven. And we won't.
In the box.
Right. What's in the box? Right. We won't go any further than that so as to not ruin it for people. Before I get to our next question, I just want to mention, after you do raise your hand, you can also unraise your hand, sort of like the flight attendant button on an airplane. So please remember to do that. Otherwise, I'll keep calling on you every few minutes all night, like I'm in Memento or something. So I see, Gus, you have a question or comment.
Yeah. I know, like, when we studied this class before, this movie before in class, we talked about all the references to movies themselves or to the theater, like at the beginning when, the blind goes up, and at the end when it comes down like a curtain, and the references to, reading from top to bottom, and something about the credits, how credits would read, and sold out house opening night. And I was just wondering if, the fact that there are these little apartments, they almost look like cells and celluloid, or, they could be storyboard or something like that. And I was just wondering if, that could be also considered part of the, the comments about, or the portrayal of the movie as commenting on movie making.
Absolutely. I mean, I had a professor in college who who never, I don't think, ever got out his ruler, but he said he would have bet money that if you looked at, for example, the windows in Raymond Burr's apartment facing the courtyard, and you measured them, that they probably had an aspect ratio that was precisely a match to most movie screens at the time, 1 to 1.85 or something like that. But yes, Gus, you're absolutely right. I mean, Hitchcock is a filmmaker who is, as Paul alluded to in his introduction, and I did as well, is always sort of trying to move toward pure cinema, which is telling his stories in ways that are purely cinematic, that can only be executed within the medium of motion pictures. And part and parcel of that is he's always conscious of the experience, and he's conscious of the apparatus, and he's conscious of, particularly in his time, that most people were going to see this by sitting together in a dark room and looking at it up on an illuminated screen. And you see this run throughout his films. Hitchcock in general is interested in voyeurism. He talked about it very much in many interviews. But if you look at other moments in other movies, I think particularly of the moment in Psycho when Norman Bates is looking through the peephole to watch Janet Leigh get ready for her shower. You see something you don't usually see in scenes like that in movies, which is the light from the room where Janet Leigh is shining through the hole onto Norman Bates's face, the way the light shines on our faces when we're in the movies. So Gus, this was very much on his mind. There are a lot of aspects of the film and of the look and the structure of the film, as some of which you referenced. I would also add that, of course, Jimmy Stewart is put in kind of the classic movie audience position, right? If you think about it, he cares very much. He's suspended his disbelief. He's become engrossed in what's unfolding on the screen or through the window across from him. He feels personally invested because in some cases it's his fiance who's over there, and he's powerless to do anything about it. You know, just like us when we're in the movies and someone says, "Hey, don't go in there," right? Or hopefully they think to themselves, "Don't go in there." We see him do that numerous times. The structure of the film and the position of Stewart's character intentionally mimics the audience experience during the movie-going experience. And there's just too many examples of that for it to be a coincidence. Paul, did I leave anything for you to say?
You did, but that was great. That was really helpful. Going back to the initial question, thinking of the sort of celluloid aspect of each of those windows, another way of putting it, really the same point, is each of those windows is another movie, and each of those windows is somebody else's drama. And part of the ethics of watching anything, or reading anything for that matter, is that we as viewers, readers, audience members in a play, etc., we are seduced into the idea that a story is being told and happening for us. It's there on our behalf. It is there to entertain us, right? Perhaps to educate us, but also to entertain. And we also often treat our own lives as narrative dramas in which we, of course, are the stars. We are the protagonists. And one of the positive things about Jimmy Stewart looking out on all those other stories is that, at least potentially, it offers the opportunity to see the other, and to see the other in a new light, in a dangerous light, as it turns out in this film. And the only other thing I would add, because it really goes to what Andrew is saying about the power of looking here, one of the more famous discussions of Hitchcock and even of this movie, and here we'll get a little theoretical, comes from Laura Mulvey, a British feminist film theorist, who wrote an essay still studied today in film schools called Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema. And it's here that she coins this notion in particular of, well, two things really. One is scopophilia, which is not a term she invents, but that she puts to a particular critical purpose, the idea of being dysfunctionally attracted to looking. So it doesn't have to only be an erotic gaze. It's not pornography only or things like that, but it's the desire to look and the inability to stop looking at others and peep into their lives. And what Mulvey does is connect that scopophilia in Hitchcock films to what she even more famously calls the male gaze, right? That there's a certain way films, not just Hitchcock's, but films in general, train us to look at people, and in particular, train us to look at women as objects. And this is something the Jimmy Stewart character is struggling with vis-a-vis Grace Kelly, right? He looks at her as a kind of overprivileged young woman that he's crazy about, but who couldn't possibly understand his adventurous photographer lifestyle, couldn't possibly share in it, couldn't possibly rough it the way he does. And so they're never going to be a fit. They come from different worlds. But as she starts to get more invested in the crime and trying to solve it, he starts looking at her in a new way. There are all these scenes where he gazes at her with new eyes and new appreciation. And that's never more pronounced than when she actually gets out of the apartment, goes down to try and dig up the flowers, and then on her own initiative, bravely, maybe foolishly, climbs up the fire escape to go into Scary Raymond Burr's apartment. And it's at that moment he is arguably more in love with her than ever, or maybe in love with her for the first time. And at the same moment, he's utterly terrified. He knows that he's put her in this jeopardy and that she has been playing this game of one-upmanship with him to show she has what it takes, to show she has the stuff to be the adventurous girlfriend. And look at the risks she's taking to do that. All of that plays out not only through Jimmy Stewart's eyes, but through the audience's eyes, and is very much about how we're conditioned to look at women in particular in classic Hollywood cinema. So that's really all I wanted to add.
Yeah, and I just want to build on that a little bit. We got a comment from one of our students, Judy, who makes the point how the film changes really very suddenly from exposition to action, and how it sort of begins what seems like a breakneck pace the moment Grace Kelly decides she believes Jimmy Stewart's theory. Once she buys in, the movie is off to the races. And that's because this film, more so than probably any other Hitchcock movie that I can think of, but more so even than a lot of movies in general, does a wonderful job of interweaving the film's romantic relationship and its plot, its main conflict. And in theory, see, musicals do this a lot, and musicals make this rather transparent because when the couple learns to perform together, they realize they're in love, they've gotten over their differences, etc. And in a way, all movies should do this. A lot of people say, why do movies have to have romance in them? Well, in theory, the romance isn't something tacked on. It's somehow relevant or integrated or attached to the plot. And that's never more true than in this movie. And as Paul was just saying, even though Jimmy Stewart should feel terrible and he puts her in a difficult spot and he's unable to help her because of his condition in the film, the fact that once she buys in and starts pursuing it with a vigor that matches his, if not exceeds it, because she's more physically capable, the narrative plot takes off, and their romance just builds, and the two of them sort of, develop neck and neck. And that's really, really great storytelling. When I said in my introduction that this is one of the most thoughtful and mature, romantic relationships that Hitchcock has in any of his movies, that's part of what makes it so interesting and complex. And I honestly think that's part of the reason why the screenplay is nominated for an Oscar. Hitchcock's screenplays, he didn't write it, John Michael Hayes did, but regardless, the screenplays for Hitchcock's movies were not typically recognized, to the extent that the movies as a whole were. In this case, this screenplay was, and I think that is a large part of the reason why.
And just one more point to add to Andrew's, the ending of the film is deliciously ambivalent in the sense that the couple has come together. She has sort of proven her mettle to be his equal or better. And they're lounging around in the apartment still because Stewart now has 2 broken legs, right? And as she's laying there reading, she's reading a book about the Himalayas. It's some kind of adventure story, we gather. But she puts it down as Jeff is dozing off again and picks up Harper's Bazaar. So there's this sense in which Lisa is both changing and trying to become certain things that Stewart's character wants, but she's also still her own person. And in that moment, we're kind of wondering, how does that relationship play out, going down the road? I saw too, Andrew, that one of the chat questions was about the casting of Grace Kelly. The person who wrote here said, Kelly turned down Eva Marie Saint's role in On the Waterfront to do Rear Window. If she had taken On the Waterfront, can you see Rear Window being the same with another actress? I guess you could ask that of both movies, right? What would both movies be like if you flipped the casting of the female lead? I don't know if, Andrew, if you had a thought about that.
I think that the right decision, I think things turned out the way they were supposed to.
Yeah.
Grace Kelly was a good actress, but I think I really would have had trouble believing she came from the tough Hoboken streets that
Right.
Eva Saint, or at least her brother, trolled. Likewise, I think that the idea of, we saw Eva Marie Saint play Icy for Hitchcock in North by Northwest, and I think she can play Icy and Detached very well, or at least she did in that film. I don't know that she would have been able to convey that sense that there's more to this sort of model pretty face the way Kelly did. So I personally am content with the way things worked out, and I think it's probably for the best.
Same here.
Dana, you've had your hand up for a while. What do you want to say?
Okay, what I'd like to say is I want to go back from being off to the races and say that oftentimes when we're looking for Hitchcock in these movies, sometimes we miss him or we look for him. Well, I felt that he was very pointed in this movie, almost shockingly so. I thought it was very interesting that he was the clock fixer. And I felt that his gaze, at least to me, broke down the fourth wall a little bit. And I felt like he was looking out at us.
Yeah.
And I was really taken with that. It was almost shocking. And I don't ever remember having that kind of a feeling when Hitchcock appears. I often miss him, but I surely didn't miss him this time.
Yeah, that moment feels almost as direct a gaze, not quite, but almost, as Raymond Burr when he finally realizes who's been watching him the whole time, right? Those are the two moments when we feel a character is acknowledging the Jimmy Stewart apartment and vis-a-vis that acknowledging us.
Yeah, I agree. And I think your observation's right, Dana, that there's no other, that usually his cameos are sort of, when they start, later in his career, they sort of start to become more noticeable and more playful. And this is kind of roughly midway through his career, a little bit past, I guess, midway. But it is one of the most direct and I think sort of pointed cameos that we see from him. Absolutely. Janet, what's your question or comment?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, so Grace Kelly, we really saw the Kelly athleticism, I guess, in her climb up that what is it, a garden trellis. But I think she probably took the part for the clothes, don't you? I mean, who wears those beautiful clothes? I wanted to ask if you didn't think that Jimmy Stewart was maybe a tiny bit delusional to think that his career of jumping in and out of planes, taking pictures was still what he was going to be doing. In real life, he's 46, although I think Thelma Ritter calls him a young man. The age difference is, always obvious, I thought. But so I didn't really believe that the future would contain his adventures being quite so vigorous, and that she, being so sensible and smart herself, might, be a real voice in their future relationship.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation. And I always sort of took that as being implicit in particularly what Thelma Ritter was saying to him, and for that matter, what his cop friend is saying to him, which is basically that, sooner or later, one's priorities have to change, and they will change. And if you're lucky, you get to make that choice, but you don't always get to make that choice. And Thelma Ritter, I think, basically just stopped short of saying, look at yourself. you know, how many more times do you want to get yourself in a fix like the one you're in before you're ready to sort of quote unquote settle down? So I think that's implicit in everyone who, every criticism or expression of skepticism of his reluctance to marry her. And frankly, I think that, you know, a lot of times we see people who are, for lack of a better term, deluding themselves. And that perhaps he is thinking that, you know, if he marries her, that will be the thing that slows him down. When in reality, he's more afraid that if he marries her, he will let himself or give himself an excuse to slow down. Paul.
Yeah, I would just add to that. You mentioned, or somebody mentioned, wanting to be part of this film just for the costumes. I would say yes. If Edith Head is doing your costuming, you want to be in any movie that she's involved in. But more seriously, to what we're talking about here, and particularly what you're saying about Grace Kelly by the end of the film, one of the establishing shots of the apartment early on shows the photo that got Stewart hurt in the first place, right? We're told by implication in conversation with his boss at the office, a scene which originally they were going to somehow do at that office. But the assistant director convinced Hitchcock that, no, we have to stay in this apartment. We're not going anywhere. And of course, that's the right thing. But the boss says, you know, you were there covering that race. You got hurt. I can't send you out again in your condition. I don't care how bad you want to go to Kashmir, which is the next world hotspot apparently in the narrative of the film. Stewart's told, you're not going. And you see the picture he takes of the race. You see a broken camera that, you know, kind of already plays on the notion of this film being about watching, viewing, directors, etc. You have a broken camera established really early on. And you have, in a sense, the broken body and the broken career of Jimmy Stewart. And by the end of that film, Grace Kelly, I suggested earlier, was an ambivalent ending, but maybe it's not so ambivalent. Grace Kelly may well be the one in charge going forward there. And that career, as great as it was, there's no apology for it, but that career has to end. And a new phase of Jimmy Stewart's life has to begin. And we have the sense that he's in good hands, that she's somebody that's going to be protective of him in the ways that he needs going forward. There is also a World War II subtext in this film that people don't often talk about, but I find really interesting. Doyle, his friend, is not just a police detective. They were in a plane together in the war. And if you know anything about Jimmy Stewart was actually a veteran who served in the Air Force. So they're playing on Jimmy Stewart's own image there. And he and Doyle come off as two friends who don't particularly like each other. They tease each other constantly. There's respect, there's camaraderie, there's history, but they don't really see the world eye to eye. That keeps them together is that camaraderie of the cockpit, sharing all those hours and years in a plane. And by the end of the film, Grace Kelly has kind of broken through that masculine world, which is not only a world of an adventurous photographer post-war, but the masculine world of these veterans who have so much in common. Really, that's all they have in common after a while. And that world gets cracked by Grace Kelly. And you can even see some antagonism between the friend Doyle and Kelly at various points in the film, especially when he doesn't believe the murder's at all real. And he actually says things like, feminine intuition doesn't take us anywhere. Why should I trust your girlfriend that this is an actual murder? And so it's all misogynistic and kind of dismissive, but it's really about this clash of male and female worlds and wartime worlds and post-war worlds. So that's all I'd want to add.
We had a couple of comments come in through the chat. Brendan asks, if the film is a criticism of society's voyeuristic tendencies, do you feel that the ending, although absolutely thrilling, undercuts the message of the film because Jimmy Stewart ends up being correct? I think that there's, I guess I don't accept the premise of the question. And I think that if Paul and I gave you the sense that we think the film is a criticism of voyeurism, I didn't mean to give you that impression. I don't think it is a criticism. Hitchcock is famous for, he's always asked why he has voyeurism so much in his films and sort of what he thinks about it. And he kind of almost says, and there's a quotation I use when I teach the course, I can't remember off the top of my head, but basically everybody does it. Nobody will admit it, but everybody does it. Nobody ever looks out the window and sees their neighbor doing something suspicious, or sees, as he says in his quotation, a pretty woman across the street. And no, he said nobody ever says, I shouldn't look, and walks away. Everybody looks. And part of his point, part of Hitchcock's point across his whole career, is that all these terrible or questionable or morally, dubious things that in most movies are what the villains do are actually things we all do. And he would say, in today's parlance, we should own it, at least to an extent. And I think that, so I don't think he would say that he disapproves of that. I think he would say he knows society says we should. But in actuality, I think your point about the end being kind of a vindication is, in a way, is right. He does sort of, it is sort of his fun way of saying, see, there's a practical good to all that voyeurism everybody's doing. But I don't think the film is intending to criticize it at all in general.
Yeah, I basically agree with Andrew here. I think if there's a criticism to be developed out of the film, it's only to the degree that this film unintentionally anticipates so many questions about the surveillance society that we now live with. So in that way, you can deploy the film, I guess, critically. But I'm not sure, I agree with Andrew here, I'm not sure that that was Hitchcock's intent. I think what he does is train a rather sardonic and witty and knowing eye on this practice, right? This is something we all do. It's sometimes something we do from relative safety, and other times it comes with real consequences. And if I understand the original question from Brendan correctly, and maybe I don't, I think he might even be asking, is the film basically pro-surveillance because Jimmy Stewart turns out to catch an actual murderer? And there is a moment in the film that touches on this. I don't think it answers it, but it touches on this, because there comes that point where Doyle, the detective friend, has given them enough information that Grace Kelly and Stewart really have some doubts about whether this murder ever happened, right? The wife might be safely away visiting friends and family. And he asks her, will we be sort of in the ethical right if he turns out not to have committed a crime? Is it okay to have done this if it proves a man innocent, not just if it proves him guilty? And Grace Kelly gets the moment there to give not only the great retort, but also the title of the film. She says, I don't know much about Rear Window ethics. And I think in that sense, ethics do matter in the film. There are ethical questions it raises. But I think Andrew's right that the film is interested in exploring the questions. It's not there to settle those questions.
I'd like to encourage people to please raise their hands. I don't see any hands up right now, but we do have a couple things coming in over the chat. Another one being, do you think Jimmy Stewart, as the wholesome guy he is, was purposefully selected for this role? He validates his voyeurism because he does not come across as a pervert. I found that I stopped questioning what he was doing and became as curious as he was because I trusted him. I find this to be a very, very interesting question, because this plays into a notion of something in film studies called star theory. That idea that when you see a star, not an actor whose name you happen to know, but a motion picture star, Jimmy Stewart, Cary Grant, George Clooney, Harrison Ford, that when you see them in a movie, you don't just bring everything that you know about them from other parts they've played to your watching of their character in that movie. You bring in everything you know about them as a public persona into your viewing of that character in the movie. And it's really interesting. And this comes up if you think about it, there are some films, a couple starring Jimmy Stewart for Alfred Hitchcock, but others in the 50s, where the protagonists do some really unsavory things. I'm thinking, if you think he's creepy in this, watch Vertigo if you haven't. And the issue is, are we willing to go along on the ride a bit more easily, or do we agree to it a bit more readily because, hey, it's Jimmy Stewart and he's such a nice guy? And I have to say that while I'm not convinced that Hitchcock cast him for that reason, I think Hitchcock liked to work with movie stars. He found them to be a very sort of potent tool in his arsenal, and one of the perks of being one of the most successful and prominent directors of his time. I do think that probably, not only, I think that probably helps us as viewers in 2020, but would have almost certainly helped people watching the film in the 1950s. If you can imagine, hey, that's Mr. Smith. Hey, that's George Bailey. So, you know, he's not going to do anything that's really unsavory. So I think that's a great point. It's a great example of sort of star theory at work. And I think in general, I'd have to agree with it.
Yeah, I think the answer to the question is yes. You know, you go with Stewart because, as Andrew so well pointed out, it takes you along a journey that might otherwise be too unsavory. So as much as I love other actors of the period, I'm just saying, you know, put Robert Mitchum in the role or put somebody else in the role. And all of a sudden the gaze becomes a slightly different gaze and maybe a more disturbing gaze from the outset. And with Stewart, you get a lot more leeway. You get a lot more license than you would otherwise. And put differently, it can in a way be more interesting to take a wholesome everyman character and have him descend into behaviors that are questionable. That journey in itself is something that is compelling.
Charles, you had your hand raised. Charles? Okay, we can come back to you, Charles. Roseanne, do you have a comment or question?
Yes, I wanted to mention two things. The first thing is when you made the when Paul made the comparison between Jimmy Stewart's isolation and our isolation, I wanted to ask, when is our cast going to come off?
Yeah, and what are we doing in the meantime?
Right, what are we doing in the meantime? But
yeah,
on
what
a
are we watching?
serious-
Who are we watching?
Right, but on a serious note, I wanted to go back to the voyeurism, and that is in this movie, I felt like the voyeurism had many layers. I felt like a voyeur watching the movie. Not only did I see what Jimmy Stewart was seeing, you know, peeping in on everybody else's lives, and you know, it's like a bunch of little different movies inside one big movie, but I'm also looking at Jimmy Stewart's life. And he doesn't have much of a life, does he? Because he's stuck in his apartment. But the thing about his life is you see, you know, that I don't really want to call it a romance because, you know, he begins to see this woman in a different way. In other words, just as he gets to know the people in those, you know, little boxes, he gets to know this woman that he's engaged to.
Mhm.
And, you know, gets a whole different picture of her. You know, she evolves too, just like all the other people in the little boxes do, and the little apartments do.
And to your point, how much time has he spent with her in the past if he's out, you know, on the road, overseas, doing his job until he got hurt? He probably spends considerably little time with her. So he never really has had proper dates with her or gotten to know her other than a few days at a time. And now he gets this extended experience with her. And that's what frightens him at first, until the end of the film when he seems to accept it.
And now we're all getting that extended tour of duty with our significant others, aren't we?
We are indeed.
We are.
Roseanne, your point ties in nicely to a couple things a couple people have asked about on the chat, which is basically talk about the other people in the other apartments and what role they serve. And a couple of them point out to Miss Lonely Hearts in particular. But I think what you see in all of those apartments is various phases and various sort of perspectives on, you know, heterosexual romantic relationships, right? You see, you know, everyone from the shy musician to Miss Torso, who doesn't seem very shy and is very actively pursued, the newlywed couple who sort of go through their, you know, we see their honeymoon period end. And Miss Lonely Hearts, of course, who is, you know, who is lonely, who longs for connection and companionship and almost to a fault. And I think those characters are there for a few reasons. One is, I think, and this is part of the brilliance, to my mind, of the screenplay, which is to give us a credible, believable, outward, I guess, exposition of what are some of the concerns and things Jimmy Stewart has going on in his mind that would make him reluctant to settle down with Lisa. Because I got to tell you, I went back to that question before about casting, and I mean, the guy's hedging on whether to marry Grace Kelly. I mean, good Lord, right? So we have to understand what he could possibly be thinking. And there's the career element, sure, but he's also thinking about all those other people and all those different phases of existence. And some of them were pushing him towards, you know, wanting to settle down and you know, be happy to have someone and you know, as they say, put a ring on it. But some of them were showing sort of some of the potential downsides of that, or at least the downsides as he would see it, given his sort of dated and stereotypical view, either that he had of marriage or that he was pretending to have. So the idea that we can see play out in the world of the film, in the course of the story, the inner concerns that the protagonist has is a brilliant choice and an opportunity that only exists because of the nature of the structure of the film, that it is looking out into this courtyard surrounded by these other apartments. So I think they play a big role. It's sort of a background or secondary role, but I think those apartments are very important.
Yeah, I couldn't
Along
agree.
those lines, the one apartment that he's not particularly interested in pursuing is the one with the married couple. They pull down the shade and it's sort of like, I don't really want to deal with them. It's funny that that's the one that he's the least interested in, because that's not where he is at the moment.
Well, I might say he's not uninterested in it. He's finding it amusing though, right? Because the implication is the newlyweds are there, they're having a lot of sex. The husband is sort of tired out. So you see these scenes with him at the window smoking a cigarette, and you hear the wife calling him back to the bedroom. So I think Andrew's onto something here in saying that windows, all those different apartments and stories, aside from all their other purposes, they are giving Stewart different perspectives on married life and also on the single life, right? So you have the frustrated composer, you have Miss Lonely Hearts, so those are icons of loneliness, but you also have married couples. And while he's kind of laughing at the younger married couple and kind of wondering maybe what he would do in the same situation, if he even wants the same situation, I find it fascinating that he is talking on the phone, I think to Doyle, but I'd have to go back and check. He's talking on the phone about not getting married, not getting tied down, and not having a nagging wife at the same time that we're watching Raymond Burr bring food into his wife before the killing happens. And the nagging that Stewart sees going on between Raymond Burr and his wife, there's a moment of identification there where Jimmy Stewart seems to be saying, that could be me. The guy I'm watching could be me. I don't want that. And so in a weird way, we have our protagonist identifying with a person who turns out to be a wife killer. And that's a typical kind of Hitchcock move to make. I was so glad too that other people brought up all the other folks in the building. I had said earlier, right, it's one of the great star-driven Hollywood films of all time. It's also one of the great ensemble films of all time. The physicality of those performances, even to the extent that they're relatively quiet compared to our leads, is so important to the film. Miss Torso, I was just watching this recently in a documentary about the film. Georgine Darcy, who plays Miss Torso, was hired, and she knew she was going to be playing this ballet, ballerina type. And Hitchcock said, I don't want her to get any formal dance training at the studio. I don't want her to look polished. I don't want her to look like someone who's actually going to make it. I want her to look like someone who's struggling to make it and probably won't in New York. And so those dance moves that she does, right, may or may not play out for her in terms of career. The guy who's playing the composer, Ross Bagdasarian, turns out to be the guy who invented the Chipmunks, who actually is a composer. Frank Cady, who plays half of the couple that has the murdered dog, you'll meet him later as Mr. Drucker on Petticoat Junction and Green Acres and those shows. So this is a cast of people, not all of whom would go on to mainstream, success as leads. But these are actors who had a purpose and a point in that film. And if they don't execute what they're doing well, the rest of the movie doesn't work. I don't care how many Jimmy Stewarts and Grace Kellys you have. You need that entire complex to be working in unison for this film to execute.
Charles, are you there now for your question? Okay. We have another interesting question come up through the comments. At the conclusion of the movie, the characters that Stewart had observed had a happy ending. Why did Hitchcock conclude the film in this way? I think they have a happy ending. I think also Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly have a happy ending. And I think the point is that we should view that if we take the ending to mean that Jimmy Stewart is settling down with Grace Kelly, we should see that as a good thing, because the one bad apple of that couple where the husband kills the wife has been rooted out of the apartment and out of the building, and everybody else has found their way to appreciate and make the best of the relationship they're in. And the same will happen with Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly. So I think it was meant to be sort of a bit of a confidence boost or a support to the ending of the main romantic story.
Right, because Miss Lonely Hearts starts to connect with the composer, right? So those two lost souls start to find each other. And it's interesting, right? They're going to call the police because they think Miss Lonely Hearts is going to kill herself. But then they get distracted with the thought that Raymond Burr is going to kill Grace Kelly. And what ends up saving Miss Lonely Hearts is the music of the composer, right? So that's going to forge the connection between them. I will say, as right as Andrew is there about the ending of the film, trying to give us a glimmer of hope in terms of human relationships, there is a moment in the film to me that's the most bone chilling, and it's not a usual Hitchcockian suspense thing. It's when the dog gets killed and the owner of the dog, the wife, right, gets out on her balcony and indicts the whole neighborhood, right? It's such a great scene. And this is what I'm getting at when I say that the ensemble cast matters here, not just physically in terms of physicality, but also even dialogue. What she says is really amazing. Which one of you did it? Which one of you killed my dog? You don't know the meaning of the word neighbor. Neighbors like each other, speak to each other, care if anybody lives or dies, but none of you do. But I couldn't imagine any of you being so low that you'd kill a little helpless friendly dog, the only thing in this whole neighborhood who liked anybody. Did you kill him because he liked you? Just because he liked you? I mean, what a powerful moment. And if there's a lingering cynicism in the film, it's not just about the fact that your neighbor across the way is a wife killer, maybe. It's the fact that your neighbors across the way don't care, and that they're so busy with their own dramas that they're not going to rally around the idea of community. And boy, is that what we're all wondering and worrying about right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. Janet, did you have another question or comment?
Yes, I do. I'd love to hear each of you talk about how interested Hitchcock is in depicting people in all different walks of life, and how interested he is in juxtaposing a sort of everyman with the sophisticate. I'm thinking particularly of the moment when the modern artwork on the wall in the apartment is sort of looked at with sort of incomprehension by the detective. And also, I don't really know the answer about Hitchcock's interests. Thank you.
Paul, do you have thoughts on this?
Why don't you tackle it first? I was going to actually answer one question online here. Somebody was writing something.
Hitchcock has always been interested in depicting, maybe not always as main characters, but depicting all this many sort of different walks of life. If you go back to his English films, I think of the 39 Steps, which sort of begins and ends with this sort of, mentalist guy doing a show, and the audience is populated by all different sorts of people. And in the beginning, there's this couple, and the man, they're a farm couple, and the man, I guess his chickens have an illness, and he's the only person who's asking a question of this mentalist. It's the man who supposedly remembers everything and knows everything. I can't remember his name, the character's name, but the man's asking him about this chicken disease, because he really wants to know, and his farm and livelihood depends on solving the problem of why his chickens are sick. And his wife, embarrassed, hits him and says, "Don't be so common." And that movie in particular, but all of Hitchcock's movies, many of Hitchcock's movies, tend to have people of different sort of, cultural stations, I guess you would say. And he doesn't sort of, he he doesn't sort of, say the ones from this class are better than the ones from this class. They're different. And in a way, a lot of times he uses those people of a different class to kind of, poke fun at or take a bit of the air of self-importance out of his main characters, to kind of point out that the things that they're thinking or worrying about, aren't really necessarily, the problems of the everyman, or maybe aren't even that serious. And I think that, in a way, you sort of see that with Doyle and Stewart. I think, Paul mentioned, I think correctly, that they don't, they're army buddies and buddies in a sense, but they don't exactly see eye to eye. I think one of the ways they don't see eye to eye is that Jimmy Stewart's off gallivanting around the world, and and Doyle is at home dealing with the sort of, he doesn't have to go to another continent to see horrible things happen. He's a New York City cop. He can see them happen then and there. And I think he thinks a number of aspects of Stewart's life are a little bit silly. And I think that that's not, one could read that or interpret it as saying we're supposed to look down on Doyle. I don't think that's true. And I don't think that's ever been sort of Hitchcock's MO. I think he's there to sort of point out, hey, people from this level of society, some of the things you think are so great are kind of a little bit silly. And I think that's part of his, and this goes back to, or ties back to, the point where he, we felt like voyeurs watching Stewart watch her, and we saw Hitchcock gaze at us. Hitchcock is famous for holding actors in low regard. I think only slightly above actors, he holds the audience. He is very happy to make us uncomfortable, and I frankly think he relished the power of being able to do so. And mostly that has to do with putting us in these uncomfortable situations of things we have to see or identify with. But some of it, I think, is, you bought a ticket, you came in, you made a choice to come here, but I'm still going to point out that the art you like is a little bit silly.
To your point, Andrew, the Doyle and Jeff relationship, Jimmy Stewart and the detective, the primal basis of it, right, is the shared war experience. To the extent it is a good friendship, I think it's built on their differences and the way they call each other on their worldviews, which is very pronounced in this film. There's as much tension between the two of them in a way as between Kelly and Stewart. Another thing with Doyle is, and talking about the male gaze here, Doyle watches Miss Torso just as much as Jimmy Stewart does. And Jimmy Stewart says, "Oh, how's your wife doing?" And Doyle gets caught at leering at the young woman. And I think Doyle is also jealous of him having Grace Kelly, of Stewart having Kelly, because he goes out of his way to make everyone uncomfortable about the idea that she's staying the night and they're not married, because he sees the slippers and the lingerie and all the rest. And it's one of these moments where, when I teach the film to students today, they really have to be given a footnote, right? They're like, what's going on? So what? She has slippers there. Why is he making a thing? And I have to explain to them that the implication is they're going to have sex. The implication is that she's going to stay over. The implication is that a landlord will not be happy about this. And Doyle is making a thing of it. And for my students, it's like that comes from another planet. But it's very important to those moments in the film. And it's where you can feel the vulnerability of Stewart, because you can feel a rise coming out of him, right? He's like, don't go there, Doyle. Don't go there. Don't say that. Don't make anything else of it. What's that?
Because watch it, Tom.
Watch it, Tom, right? Like, there's a line you don't cross in this friendship, and it's like Doyle's right on the edge of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Sort of related to this comment is a comment in the chat from Keith, where he talks about Lisa starts out as a bit shallow, or rich, a fancy girl, and then grew to become, the real hero of the film. And Stewart diminished over time, in part because of his reaction, Keith says, to Miss Lonely Hearts. And I think that we can all agree that, Lisa, Grace Kelly's character sort of grows. I shouldn't say she necessarily grows. I think our perception of her and the film's opinion of her grows. I frankly tend to be convinced that she was that person the whole time, but she was so used to being thought of as a certain way, in a certain way, because she was a model and because she looks the way she does and she works in fashion, that she tended to sort of leave people alone and let them think that way about her, because she made up her mind a long time ago. It was just easier to go through life that way. But she has always been a person of greater substance, greater resourcefulness. And I think it just takes time for the film to give her a chance to reveal that. It also takes time for Jimmy Stewart to notice that, or to accept it. And that's, I think her character goes through, I don't want to say her character goes through the greatest transformation, because again, I believe she was that way all along. But in terms of perception, I think her character, or revealing, or being perhaps with her own comfort of being thought of as that complicated a person, that's what changes over time. Whereas I don't think Stewart's character really does, except on the question of marriage, which again, as I've stated before, really when it's Grace Kelly should be a no-brainer, and I don't consider that a great character transformation. The other thing I would say is we talked about star text with Jimmy Stewart. One can imagine Grace Kelly was on probably more than one occasion perceived the way her character is, right? She's a pretty face. She's an actress. She comes from this well-to-do family. She doesn't think about these things, or couldn't understand these things, or access these emotions. But she turned out, I think, to be a person of greater substance than some of her sort of casual fans or detractors might have necessarily given her credit for.
So in essence, Jimmy Stewart is misleading us about who she is and what she is. And we have to wean ourselves from his way of looking at her in the course of the film. I think Andrew's absolutely right. She didn't change overnight into somebody interesting. She is somebody interesting. It just needed to be recognized. One of the actors in recent television, which has gotten better and better, who has taken on Grace Kelly as a kind of model, both in terms of playing the character, but also the way a character was written by the staff, is January Jones in Mad Men. So the way she plays Betty Draper is in many ways based on a kind of Grace Kelly model. And a lot of the male characters in that show, even her own husband to a degree, Don Draper, dismiss her or trivialize her as a kind of Grace Kelly. But the Grace Kelly January Jones was really going for in that role was the Grace Kelly who had hidden depths, the person who had a whole lot more going on with her than people were willing to recognize. And I think, this is a template that a lot of actors have followed ever since.
We've gotten a couple of questions. We got one on the chat, and I got one in over email about the cinematography of the film, which was also, as I mentioned, nominated for an Oscar. Not a sort of standard thing for a Hitchcock film. A lot of people tended to give him primary or sole credit for the sort of visual elements of the film, when of course,
and even he never won, right, Andrew? Isn't that correct?
He never won for directing,
Okay.
right? But the cinematography in this film is particularly interesting, in part because of that massive set and the sort of necessities of navigating it. I mean, it was obviously a set built to be filmed in, so that was a bit of a help. But one of the questions is about the sort of the use of lighting and shadows. And I think Hitchcock uses light and shadow in many of his films in fairly across the board and overall, I should say, in fairly consistent ways, where brightness is meant to represent, either goodness or knowledge or insight or revelation, and darkness is meant to represent sort of, sinister elements or flaws or things like that. But I think in this film, it functions a bit differently, of course, because there are the kind of the competing concern in terms of the lighting of the necessity of being able to see those windows and see into those apartments. And of course, Jimmy Stewart, particularly in certain scenes we've referenced, being able to be in the dark and hidden. And of course, on top of that is that dynamic, the extent to which you agree or don't, that they're trying to sort of emulate the movie going dynamic as well. So it's a bit more complicated, I think, in this film, but I think in this movie, more so than many others, it ties into that notion of seeing, and seeing being power. And Jimmy Stewart has the power. He's in the dark, but what he's looking at is in the light, and that gives him the power, along with his exceedingly longer and longer lenses, to see what is unfolding. And the moment that the gaze is turned back on him, of course, is a revelation within the film, and leads to his greatest moment of perhaps individual or direct crisis. I think he's probably more worried for Lisa than he is for himself in that moment. But so I think in this film, more so than in others, the light and the dark function in addition to the ways they normally do. There's two sort of overlaying concerns or considerations, I should say. One is the movie going dynamic, and the other is the sort of, in this film, the ability to see and be seen being more directly tied to the plot than in other movies.
And Andrew, to your point, something that you referenced in your video intro, when Hitchcock was in his early days and making all those interesting early period Hitchcock films, he wasn't just working within the context of the British film industry, but also of German training and German expressionism. And that has so much to do with his sense of light and dark going forward, even into the color era. And what you were saying just now, I think gets perfectly exemplified in the climax when Burr storms into the apartment, not knowing, I think, if he wants to cut a deal with Stewart or kill him or both. And how does Stewart defend himself? He only has the flash bulb that he has to so awkwardly, mechanically reinsert in order to flash it into Burr's face and delay what seems like an inevitable murder. And it's a comic moment. It's an absurd moment. It's also spot on thematically. And really, in a nice way, parodies your usual kind of climax of that sort in a crime film or a film noir, where the protagonist would have a gun and might be firing the gun and be missing. But in this case, all he has is the flashbulb, which foregrounds all these issues you're raising about the camera in this film and beyond.
Yeah, and also, how do you have your protagonist and antagonist fight when one of them's in a wheelchair and can't fight?
Yeah.
And of course, it's tied to his profession. It's tied to the power to see, and it's tied to the questions about cinematography. The presence of light is normally a good thing, and in that case, it's a good thing for Stewart. But it's such a sudden and powerful presence of light. Of course, it can be debilitating, just like everything else.
So it's the power to see and the power to blind.
Right. We got a question about where this film falls into Kelly's career. I'm not sure precisely, but I'd say it's roughly toward the middle. I know that she stops making movies in Hollywood, certainly by the late 50s. And I know she started, her career sort of picked up steam right around 1950. So this is more or less in the middle, but you could look at her filmography on TCM's website or IMDb to get a more precise answer to that, I think.
And this is only 2 years removed, I think, from High Noon, which is another eye-opener, because the character she's playing in that film, you think so many things about her are figured out. And then by the end of the movie, she's the one firing the gun side by side, right, with our protagonist. Drawing a blank again, who is it in High Noon?
Gary Cooper.
Gary Cooper, right. So another movie where we can take that kind of model image of Kelly and subvert it in really interesting ways.
Well, we've reached the end of our hour. We've actually gone over a little bit, and it also seems like the questions have kind of died down. So I think this is as good a place as any to call it. Thank you very much, excuse me, Paul, for joining us for this discussion. And thank you very much to everyone for joining us and participating as well. Please check out the filmed introduction if you didn't on our website. Also on Thursday, we'll be announcing a new film, and there'll be another discussion on Monday night. So go to brynmarfilm.org and look for film studies online to find out all the things we're doing. And thank you so much for joining us and participating. And a special thanks to you, Paul. I know you spend a lot of your day teaching over the web, and we're glad you could join us to do a little bit more of it.
It was a delight and a pleasure. Thank you. And I hope we'll see all of you, or many of you at least, in person again someday soon.
Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you.
Thank you.
That
Thank
part's
you.
funny.